The desert was a place where empires lived or died. Across its vast, silent hostility, a fragile network of trails became the hidden life support system for entire civilizations. This is the story of the desert trade routes, the ancient superhighways that defied the impossible. By the end of our journey, you will understand how these routes built our modern world, connecting continents long before maps existed. We will uncover how a single animal turned sand into a sea of commerce, and why cities of gold rose from nothing only to vanish without a trace. What does it truly take to build a global network when every mile wants you gone? To cross these deserts was to wage a daily war against the elements. The hostility was absolute, and it came in many forms. Under the sun in Arabia's empty quarter, heat did not simply rise, it pressed down, a physical weight that could wick the moisture from a human body in mere hours. Yet that same landscape, when night fell over the go-by, transformed into a realm of piercing cold, where temperatures plummeted to levels that threatened frostbite and demanded every scrap of insulation a traveler could muster. And always there was the wind. In the Sahara, it was a sculptor of continents, carrying blasts of sand that could strip paint from wood and etch glass, scouring everything in its path, including human skin. This was not a blank space on a map. It was a dynamic, living ecosystem with its own brutal rules. The great Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta, who traversed these realms in the 14th century, called the desert a sea without water, a perfect analogy for its vast, trackless, and drowning isolation. But the challenge extended far beyond weather. Unseen threats lurked in the emptiness. Bandits knew these trails were lifelines, and they preyed upon the slow and the unprepared. Political borders shifted like the dunes, turning a safe passage one year into a contested gauntlet the next. And perhaps most draining of all was the psychological weight of the void, the endless horizons that could compress weeks into a feeling of perpetual stillness, testing the human spirit as much as the body. To even contemplate building a lasting trade route here seems like folly, yet that is precisely what happened. The very severity of the landscape became the forge in which a unique form of ingenuity was hammered out. Into this war of attrition, humanity introduced a living vehicle, a biological marvel that turned the desert's rules against itself. The dromedary camel, with its single hump and legendary endurance, was not merely an animal. It was the irreplaceable engine of desert commerce, a creature so perfectly adapted it seemed designed for the task. Picture a single beast, capable of carrying over 400 pounds of cargo, walking for more than 100 miles across blistering sands without a single drop of water. That is not a myth. It is simple biology harnessed by human ingenuity. The true revolution began around 1,000 years before the Common Era, with the domestication and selective breeding of these animals in Arabia and North Africa. This was not just taming a wild creature, it was co-evolving with a partner, shaping its strength to serve a grand ambition. Archaeologists studying ancient saddle designs note how they were meticulously adapted over centuries. Early saddles distributed weight to protect the camel's spine, allowing it to bear heavier loads for longer distances without injury. Later designs incorporated frames for securing precious cargo like bolts of silk or blocks of salt, transforming the camel from a simple beast of burden into a stable, moving warehouse. The camel's prowess stems from a suite of physiological superpowers. Its kidneys are ultra-efficient, producing urine thick as syrup to conserve every possible molecule of water. The famous hump is not a water tank, but a dense reserve of fat that can be metabolized for both energy and hydration. Even its blood cells are oval-shaped, allowing them to keep flowing smoothly during severe dehydration when a human's round cells would clump together. This biological toolkit made the camel the only vessel capable of sailing the sandy sea. The economic impact was immediate and profound. Where once only small, precious items could be risked on a human porter's back, now vast caravans, sometimes thousands of camels strong, could transport bulk goods. Gold from West Africa could travel north to Mediterranean ports. Salt from Saharan mines could journey south to kingdoms where it was worth its weight in gold. Spices, ivory, and textiles began flowing in quantities previously unimaginable, weaving continents together. This new scale of trade directly enabled the rise of entire cities in the middle of nowhere. Consider the Nabatean kingdom with its capital at Petra. This magnificent city of rose-red stone did not rise in a fertile valley or on a coastline. It emerged in a rugged desert canyon in modern-day Jordan, solely because it controlled the vital intersection of caravan routes. Petra's wealth, its stunning temples carved directly into cliff faces, was all funded by the taxes and services it provided to the endless trains of camels and merchants. So we must ask, how different would our world map look if the camel had never entered human service? Would the Sahara have remained an impenetrable barrier? Would the riches of Africa and Asia have remained isolated, never sparking the connections that fueled empires? The mastery of this living ship was a monumental leap, but it was only one component. A vessel is useless without a navigator, and in the desert, that role fell to individuals who carried maps not on parchment but in memory. The desert at night offered the only reliable map. Under a dome of infinite stars, a caravan master would look up not in wonder but in calculation. For him, the constellations were not myths but signposts. The steady North Star provided an unwavering reference, while the seasonal arcs of other stars helped mark the passage of time and direction across a sea of identical sand. This celestial knowledge was vital, but it was only one layer of a much deeper skill set. The true navigators of these voids were individuals known by many names, often called guides or khabir in Arabic traditions. They possessed a silent knowledge, a mental atlas of the hostile terrain, passed down orally through generations within tribes like the Tuareg of the Sahara or the Bedouin of Arabia. To an outsider, the desert is a terrifying blankness. To a khabir, it is a detailed text. He could read the shape of a dune sculpted by prevailing winds to understand his orientation. He recognized the faint discoloration on the horizon that hinted at a distant salt flat. He knew that the presence of a certain hardy, deep-rooted plant often indicated subsurface moisture, pointing the way toward a hidden seep. Some accounts even suggest guides could discern their location by the taste and granular texture of the sand carried on the wind. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote of these desert pathfinders with a mix of awe and puzzlement, noting their ability to traverse lands where no road was visible. Their toolkit was both ancient and sophisticated. Beyond the stars, they used simple, profound markers. Travelers would build small cairns of stone at crucial points, creating a chain of silent guides for those who followed. Later, instruments like the astrolabe were adapted from maritime use to help fix positions on land. But the core of navigation remained an intimate, living memory of the land itself. Consider the Taklamakan Desert in Central Asia, a name often translated as the place of no return or the Sea of Death. For centuries, a complex web of trails crossed its deadly expanse, connecting the oasis towns along the Silk Road. Navigating it required understanding the brutal seasonal wind patterns to avoid sandstorms and knowing the precise, fleeting locations where meltwater from distant mountains might briefly touch the desert's edge. This knowledge was so valuable it was often guarded, a source of power and security for the tribes who held it. So what does it mean to truly read a landscape that appears utterly featureless? It means seeing time in dune shapes, tasting geography in the air, and hearing direction in the silence. This celestial and terrestrial wisdom made travel possible, but it was not enough. A caravan could have the perfect vessel and the most skilled navigator, yet still perish without the desert's most precious and hidden resource. The first glimpse of an oasis was a moment of pure salvation. After days of unbroken gold and white, a weary caravan cresting a dune would see a shock of deep green, a cluster of date palms whispering of shade and water. This was not a lucky accident of nature, but a critically engineered feat of survival. An oasis was a living machine, and its most vital component often flowed invisibly, deep beneath the sand. In Persia and across the arid world, ancient engineers perfected a system called the qanat. This was a gently sloping underground channel, painstakingly dug by hand, that tapped into water trapped in mountain aquifers, sometimes fossil water that had fallen as rain thousands of years earlier. The qanat would guide this water for miles through the dry earth by gravity alone to emerge at the surface in a settlement below. Hydrologists studying these systems note their brilliant efficiency. By keeping the water underground, they prevented evaporation in the scorching air, delivering a cool, reliable stream to the surface where it could sustain life. This was ancient, sustainable engineering on a grand scale. The water was just the beginning. An oasis was a self-contained production center. Date palms provided a calorie-rich food that could be dried and stored for long journeys. Their fronds offered shade and material for repairs. In their shadow, smaller gardens grew vegetables and fodder for the camels. This transformed the oasis from a simple watering hole into a resupply depot and a bustling marketplace. A caravan arriving at a place like Sijil Mossa in Morocco or the legendary Palmyra in Syria did not just find water. It found blacksmiths to repair tools, markets to trade goods, and inns for rest. The wealth generated from supplying these caravans allowed some oases to grow into powerful, independent city-states. Palmyra, rising from the Syrian desert, grew fabulously wealthy by taxing the trade between the Roman and Parthian empires, its grand colonnades and temples funded entirely by its strategic position as a desert port. Consider the Al-Hossa Oasis in eastern Arabia, one of the largest in the world. For over 4,000 years, its complex network of springs and canals has sustained a vast agricultural landscape and served as a crucial waypoint for traffic crossing the Arabian Peninsula. Its continued existence is a testament to generations of careful, communal water management. This success, however, highlights a profound fragility. An oasis was a balanced ecosystem. Its lifeblood was a finite resource, often a non-renewable fossil aquifer. Overuse, a shift in climate, or a disruption in the social order that maintained the qanats could doom it. The stories of lost cities in the desert are often stories of lost water. What does the ancient, meticulous care of an oasis teach us today? It shows that in the most hostile environments, survival is not about domination, but about delicate, sustained stewardship. These green islands were the indispensable nodes that made the network real. But connecting these dots across hundreds of miles of wilderness required more than just camels and maps. It demanded a system of trust, of shared rules that could bind strangers together in a common purpose under the relentless sun. From the oasis, the caravan assembled, a moving city preparing to cross the void. The scale was staggering. Imagine a line of over 10,000 camels departing Timbuktu, a procession of animals and people that could stretch for miles, visible from horizon to horizon. This was not a haphazard group of travelers. It was a complex socio-economic institution, a feat of logistics on a continental scale. Wealthy merchant families or sometimes entire states would sponsor these expeditions, organizing them with a military-like hierarchy. At the top were the caravan masters, seasoned veterans who commanded the route and timing. Beneath them moved a small society, guards armed with swords and spears to deter bandits, skilled camel drivers who knew each animal's temperament, cooks who prepared communal meals over desert fires, and merchants who negotiated the fate of empires with the goods on their backs. Economic historians see in this system an early, brilliant form of standardized logistics. Caravans ran on established schedules, synchronized with seasonal weather patterns and the ripening of dates at distant oases. There were known tariffs to pay at certain gates and resting points precisely spaced a day's journey apart. This organization was all about mitigating profound risk. Safety in numbers was the first principle, a large caravan presenting a formidable deterrent to raiders. Shared resources were the second, spreading the cost of guides, guards, and tolls across many, making the journey viable for smaller merchants. And upon arrival, the caravan wielded collective bargaining power, negotiating prices as a unified block rather than as isolated individuals. The cargo they carried tells the story of connected worlds. Yes, there were luxury items, silk and ivory and gold, goods whose high value justified the perilous journey, but the lifeblood of these routes was often bulk staples. Salt, mined in great slabs from the heart of the Sahara, was transported south to regions where it was essential for health and food preservation, sometimes traded literally ounce for ounce with gold. Grain, cloth, and copper tools flowed in the opposite direction. A powerful illustration is the annual Azalai salt caravan in Mali. For centuries, this tradition has seen Tuareg merchants lead camels to the remote Taoudeni basin to collect salt slabs, a journey of hundreds of miles that continues in adapted form even today, a living thread to an ancient economic pattern. Consider the immense planning this required, all without a single radio or map, coordinating the departure of thousands of camels, securing provisions for months, hiring specialists, and aligning with other merchant groups was an exercise in social trust and meticulous oral contract. The caravan's slow, rhythmic movement across the landscape was a calculated gamble, a mobile economy rolling through emptiness, and wherever such concentrated wealth moves, power inevitably gathers around it. The immense profits generated by this organized trade did not just enrich merchants, they built kingdoms and attracted the gaze of empires who saw not just commerce but control. The desert's harshness created a powerful paradox. This landscape of profound scarcity became the very engine for generating immense surplus and centralized power. For the empires that rose around its edges, control was not about owning the barren miles themselves, but about mastering the gates through which wealth flowed. Political power shifted its foundation. It was no longer rooted solely in fertile farmland, but increasingly in the ability to tax, protect, and monopolize the currents of long-distance trade. The great 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun observed this pattern in his work on social cohesion, noting how the wealth generated from commerce enabled new dynasties to form, build loyal armies, and project authority far beyond their core territories. This was the birth of the empires of the sand, whose fortunes were irrevocably tied to the camel caravans moving through the void. Consider the Roman Empire. Its appetite for Eastern luxuries was insatiable. Silk from China, spices from India, incense from Arabia. These were not just goods but symbols of status and refinement in Rome itself. To secure this flow, Rome did not need to conquer the entire desert. Instead, it sought to control the endpoints and key way stations. They formed alliances with desert kingdoms, established protectorates over vital ports, and their legions sometimes patrolled the fringes of trade corridors to ensure safe passage. The wealth extracted from this trade filled the imperial coffers, funding monumental building projects and the vast military machine that protected the borders. Similarly, far to the south, the Ghana Empire, flourishing between the 6th and 13th centuries, built its legendary wealth on a different desert exchange. Sitting between the gold fields of West Africa and the salt mines of the Sahara, Ghana's rulers established a brilliant monopoly. They taxed every ounce of gold that headed north and every slab of salt that came south. Arab historians of the time wrote of a king so rich that the nuggets of gold extracted from his mines were reserved solely for the royal treasury, while gold dust was left for the people to trade. Ghana's power was not in mining the gold itself, but in controlling the precise point where it entered the desert trade network. The mechanisms of this control were both subtle and direct. The most straightforward was taxation. Caravans approaching a fortified city or a mountain pass would be required to pay a duty, a percentage of the value of their goods, for the privilege of safe passage and access to markets. In return, empires often provided military escorts through particularly dangerous stretches, a service that justified the fee and ensured the continued flow of commerce. They also invested in the infrastructure of trade itself, building fortified way stations known as Caravanserais. These were not simple inns, but defensible complexes with high walls, storerooms, water wells, and space for hundreds of animals. By spacing these strongholds a day's journey apart, an empire could effectively channel and protect trade along a desired corridor, making the route both safer and more profitable for everyone involved, while firmly stamping their authority upon it. No example illustrates this dynamic more clearly than the Nabatean kingdom. As we touched on earlier, this civilization carved its magnificent capital, Petra, directly into the desert cliffs. Their power stemmed entirely from controlling the incense route, the vital artery for frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean. The Nabateans mastered the desert. They controlled the scarce water sources along the route, forcing caravans to stop at their stations and pay hefty fees. They provided security and guides. For centuries, this strategy made them rich and independent, a desert power that even the early Roman Republic treated with respect. Yet, in the end, that very wealth became their undoing. The Roman Empire, under Emperor Trajan, looked at the lucrative flow of goods through Petra and saw an opportunity for direct control. In the year 106, Rome annexed the Nabatean kingdom, turning it into the province of Arabia Patria. The empire did not destroy Petra, it absorbed its function, redirecting the trade wealth directly to Rome. This raises a fundamental question about the nature of power in such landscapes. Is true power born from producing something, or from controlling the connection between those who produce and those who consume? The answer, forged in the desert heat, seems to be that connection itself becomes the ultimate product. The wealth that flowed from taxing silks and salt did more than just build palaces and fund armies. It created something even more enduring. The constant movement of people along these routes meant that ideas, technologies, and beliefs hitched a ride alongside the material goods. A merchant resting at a caravanserai might share news of a new philosophy from a distant capital. An artisan traveling with a caravan could bring a novel technique for weaving or metalworking to a new land. The desert, often seen as a barrier, was in fact a great filter, a slow-moving conveyor belt that selectively carried the most resilient elements of culture across continents. This sets the stage for an even more profound exchange, one that moved beyond spices and silk to touch the very core of human belief. That single bale of silk, woven in a Chinese workshop, carried more than just thread. As it passed from merchant to merchant across the vastness of Asia, each handoff transferred something invisible. Nestled beside the shimmering fabric might be a Buddhist monk's carefully copied sutra, a Zoroastrian priest's whispered prayer on the wind, or a trader's rough sketch of a Greek astrolabe. The goods were the excuse, the ideas were the real cargo. Historians like Peter Frankopan reframe our view of these networks, calling them the Silk Roads, plural, and arguing they were the central nervous system of global history for centuries, a sprawling web of overland trails that connected the world long before the age of exploration. This was the ultimate desert trade route, a complex lattice of paths that dared to skirt the deadly voids of the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts, linking the imperial courts of Zion with the bustling forums of Rome. It was not one road but many, a shifting, adaptive network where culture itself was the most precious and durable commodity. Consider the transmission of faith. Buddhism originated in India, but it was along these desert tracks that it journeyed into the heart of China and beyond. Monks and pilgrims, like the famous Chinese traveler Xuanzang in the 7th century, braved the brutal Taklamakan not for profit, but for sacred texts and teachings. The monasteries that grew up in oasis towns like Dunhuang became way stations of the soul, where scriptures were translated and artistic styles blended, creating a new visual language for the divine that would eventually reach Korea and Japan. In the opposite direction, artistic ideas flowed with equal power. After Alexander the Great's campaigns reached Central Asia, a fascinating fusion occurred. In the region of Gandhara, near modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, sculptors began depicting the Buddha, but they did so using the artistic techniques of classical Greece. The result was statues with serene, Hellenistic faces and gracefully draped robes, a stunning visual dialogue between two worlds made possible by the constant traffic of people and ideas. Technology, too, was a traveler. The Chinese secrets of papermaking moved westward, revolutionizing record-keeping and learning in the Islamic world and later Europe. The humble stirrup, which gave cavalry riders unprecedented stability and power, migrated from East Asia into the hands of European knights, altering the very nature of warfare and society. No place embodies this convergence better than Samarkand. For over 2 millennia, this city in modern Uzbekistan was a legendary crossroads. Here, in its bustling markets and scholarly centers, Persian poetry met Indian mathematics, Chinese silk met Mediterranean glass, and Zoroastrian fire temples stood not far from newly built Buddhist stupas and later Islamic madrasas. Samarkand was a living laboratory of human connection, proof that the desert was not a wall but a bridge. So we must ask, what would our modern world be missing without this ancient dialogue? Would our art, our philosophies, our very technologies look the same? The silent exchange along those sandy trails shaped the foundations of civilizations from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Yet for all the grandeur of silk and scripture, the desert trade network had another, more visceral currency, one that was literally worth its weight in gold and sustained the basic fabric of life itself. In a Timbuktu marketplace, a merchant's scales held the balance of a continent. On one side, a rough, gray slab of rock salt, on the other, a shimmering pile of pure gold dust. This was not a fantastical scene, but the daily reality of the Sahara's most profound economic equation, a perfect symmetry of need forged across 1,000 miles of sand. The principle was brutally simple. In the tropical regions south of the desert, salt was a biological necessity. In a hot climate where people sweat profusely, salt is crucial for maintaining bodily function, and it was the only effective means of preserving food in an era before refrigeration. Yet the land there yielded almost none. Conversely, the rivers of West Africa, like the Senegal and the Niger, washed down incredible quantities of alluvial gold, a metal that held little practical use for the societies that mined it, but was coveted as a symbol of power and divinity in the Mediterranean world and beyond. Neither side had what they needed, and each possessed exactly what the other desired. Economic anthropologists see in this a classic case of complementary resource distribution, a geographical accident that created one of history's most stable and lucrative long-distance trade systems. It was a partnership born of mutual desperation and mutual benefit. To understand the weight on that scale, we must journey to the source of the salt. Deep in the northern Sahara lay mines like Tagheza and Taoudeni, places of almost unimaginable hardship. These were not underground caverns, but open pits in a blinding white landscape of salt and clay, where the sun's reflection was a weapon. Here, salt was cut by hand into massive rectangular slabs, each one destined to become a currency bloc. The labor was grueling and often involved individuals in extremely difficult circumstances, with historical accounts noting the reliance on enslaved populations. A single slab could weigh nearly 200 pounds. These would be loaded onto camels, each animal carrying 2 slabs, to begin the months-long journey south. The caravans moved in a slow, solemn procession, a line of white blocks traversing an ocean of gold sand, heading toward the forests where gold was panned from riverbeds. The gold traveled north, often in the form of dust carefully sealed in feather quills, to be weighed against the salt in the great trading cities. This flow of mineral wealth built empires. The Ghana Empire and later the Mali Empire under the legendary Mansa Musa derived their phenomenal power not from hoarding gold, but from controlling its point of exchange. They taxed every ounce that entered the trade network, amassing treasuries that became the stuff of global legend. The social impact of this nexus was transformative. It gave birth to and sustained legendary urban centers that were otherwise impossible in their locations. Timbuktu, Gao, and Jen were not cities of agricultural plenty. They were cities of commerce, intellectual exchange, and administrative power, all funded by the salt-gold trade. Their great mosques and universities, built from sun-baked mud brick, were monuments to the wealth generated by this desert exchange. The case of Mansa Musa is the most spectacular example. His pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century is famous for its staggering display of gold, an act that reportedly depressed the metal's price in Cairo for years. But that gold came from the rivers of his empire, its value unlocked only because it could be traded north for the salt his people required. This system was so resilient that echoes of it persist. In Niger, the annual Bilma Salt Caravan continues, a centuries-old tradition where Tuareg guides lead camels to the remote salt pans of the Tenner Desert, returning with slabs to trade in southern markets. It is a living, breathing connection to an economic pattern older than many modern nations. So we must reflect, how does a basic, universal human need like salt become the foundation for such complex civilization? It reveals that the most enduring economic systems are not built on luxury alone, but on fulfilling fundamental requirements across great divides. The wealth from this trade, however, did more than build cities and fill treasuries. It was about to be deployed in a single, breathtaking act that would rewrite the map of the world's perception, turning a desert king into the richest person in history and broadcasting the power of Africa to a stunned and distant Europe. The legendary wealth of Mansa Musa was not hoarded in a silent vault. It flowed outward, a golden river that funded the very spaces where the world came together. At dusk, within the high, sun-baked walls of a desert caravanserai, you could hear a dozen languages weaving through the smoky air. Persian merchants haggled over bolts of silk, Berber camel drivers shared tales of sandstorms over a communal meal, and a Chinese envoy sketched notes about a new astrolabe design. This was not just an inn, it was the beating social heart of the entire trade network, a purpose-built machine for security, rest, and connection. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo, journeying in the 13th century, wrote with awe of these way stations, describing their reliability and the sheer diversity of people they gathered under one roof. Their design was a masterpiece of practical architecture. Built a day's journey apart, they offered a predictable refuge. Thick, windowless walls and a single, heavy gate provided defense against raiders. Inside, a vast central courtyard housed the animals, surrounded by 2 levels of rooms for merchants and their goods. A small mosque or temple often stood in one corner, catering to the spiritual needs of a transient, multi-faith population. A caravanserai was a self-contained world, a microcosm of the connected continents it served. These hubs scaled up into legendary market cities, places whose names alone evoked the romance of far-flung commerce. Palmyra, rising from the Syrian desert, was not a natural oasis but a deliberate creation of trade, its grand colonnades funded by taxing the incense caravans. Petra, hidden in its Jordanian canyon, controlled the water and the narrow passages, forcing all wealth to flow through its gates. Far to the east, in the foothills of the Pamir Mountains, Kashgar thrived as a Silk Road pivot point, where Chinese goods met Central Asian horses and Mediterranean glass. And the sensory overload of Cairo's Khan el-Khalili Bazaar, with its labyrinthine alleys and scent of spices, is a direct descendant of the medieval trade networks that made Cairo a supreme commercial crossroads. In Iran, the ruins of countless caravanserais still stand along the old Silk Road routes, silent stone skeletons that tell of centuries of relentless exchange. Think of these places as the ancient internet. They were the physical nodes where data, in the form of news, innovations, stories, and beliefs, was downloaded and uploaded by every traveler who passed through. The caravanserai was a neutral ground, a temporary haven where the rules of the road enforced a fragile peace. But this peace was always conditional, maintained by a balance of power and mutual need. Beyond those fortified walls, the same routes that carried silk and scripture could also carry conflict, and the immense value moving through the desert created shadows that followed every caravan. That golden river of commerce had a shadow flowing beside it, a current of profound human hardship. The glittering wealth that built empires and funded universities was not sustained by silk and salt alone. For centuries, another tragic commodity moved along these same desert trails. Historical research into the trans-Saharan trade networks reveals that alongside the caravans of luxury goods, there were caravans of individuals captured and transported under conditions of immense difficulty. This practice formed a deeply entrenched part of the economic landscape across the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula for over 1,000 years, with certain regions in West and Central Africa being repeatedly targeted. The journey itself was a harrowing ordeal. Captives were forced to walk hundreds of miles across the desert, often bound together and suffering from exposure and lack of water. Historians note the scale was significant, with estimates suggesting millions of individuals were moved over the centuries, leading to lasting demographic and cultural shifts in both the regions that lost people and the empires that received them. Upon reaching destinations like the markets of North Africa or the Middle East, these individuals entered into various roles. Some were forced into labor in salt mines or agricultural estates, others served in military units, and some worked in domestic settings. Later, ports like Zanzibar on the Swahili coast became major hubs for this trade, connecting the African interior to markets across the Indian Ocean. It is crucial to understand this not as a separate system, but as a thread woven directly into the fabric of desert commerce. The very same salt road that carried life-preserving mineral slabs south also carried captured individuals north. Communities like the Tuareg, masters of desert navigation, sometimes acted as guides and transporters within this system, highlighting the complex and often painful interdependencies that the trade network created. This presents us with a difficult historical reflection. How do we reconcile the magnificent cultural and technological exchanges, the libraries of Timbuktu and the architectural wonders of Samarkand, with this foundational moral failing of the era? It requires holding two truths at once, acknowledging that human progress and human suffering have often traveled the same road. This dark undercurrent of exploitation was a constant, but it existed alongside a more immediate and universal threat to every traveler, a danger that lurked not in the ledgers of merchants, but in the empty spaces between the dunes. The silence at the desert well was broken only by the shifting of tired camels and the low murmur of negotiation. A caravan leader, his robes dusty from weeks of travel, placed a measured weight of silver coins into the hand of a Tuareg warrior, whose face was veiled against the blowing sand. This was not a surrender to banditry. It was a transaction as formal as any in a city marketplace, a payment for safe passage under the recognized authority of the tribe that controlled this stretch of the Sahara. In the vast spaces between empires, security was not a given. It was a service carefully brokered and paid for, built upon a complex web of relationships that functioned as the true law of the desert. Historians describe this as a system of protection rent, a fee paid to those with the power to guarantee safety or, conversely, to withhold violence. For merchant guilds planning a months-long journey, striking a treaty known as an ammon with a powerful nomadic confederation was not just prudent, it was essential business. Tribes like the Bedouin of Arabia or the Tuareg of North Africa held the ultimate advantage, an intimate, generational knowledge of the terrain that no foreign army could ever match. Their honor codes, while alien to outside courts, were binding. A tribe that accepted payment for protection staked its reputation on delivering it, as violating such an agreement damaged their standing and their future income. This often made a tribal escort more reliable than the promise of a distant emperor whose soldiers might never arrive. Practical security was a layered defense. Caravans hired their own mercenary guards, often drawn from other nomadic groups renowned for their martial skill, like the Rashida of the Red Sea Hills, who were famed as caravan guides and protectors across the harsh terrain between the Nile and the Red Sea. Timing was also a weapon. Journeys were planned to avoid seasons when certain raider groups were known to be active, or to move in concert with the migrations of protector tribes. States themselves invested in fixed points of safety, building fortified posts called ribats along major routes. These served as military garrisons, shelters, and visible symbols of imperial interest, creating islands of order in the wilderness. The relationship was always dynamic, a balance between mutual benefit and latent threat. The Tuareg confederations of the Central Sahara, for instance, were the undisputed masters of their domain. For centuries, trans-Saharan caravans relied on Tuareg guides for navigation and protection through the most lethal dunes. The same tribes, however, could easily become predators if agreements broke down or if a caravan ventured without their permission. This duality was not hypocrisy. It was the reality of power in a landscape where formal government faded away. It forces us to ask, how is true order maintained in a place beyond the reach of courts and police? The answer, etched in the sand, was that order became a commodity, negotiated, purchased, and maintained through a fragile ecology of honor and need. Ensuring the physical safety of goods and people was a monumental achievement, but it was only half the battle. To make trade flow smoothly across languages, cultures, and thousands of miles, another, more abstract pillar of civilization had to be constructed. A merchant in Baghdad had a problem. He had just sold a shipment of Persian carpets for a small fortune in silver dinars, but his family and business partners lived in the faraway city of Cordoba, on the other side of the known world. Sending that heavy, tempting chest of coins across deserts and pirate-infested seas was an invitation for disaster. Yet, within weeks, his relatives in Spain were able to collect the full value of the sale in their own local currency, without a single coin ever leaving Iraq. This was the miracle of the desert's invisible currency, a financial revolution built not on gold but on trust. The physical dangers of moving wealth sparked one of history's most profound innovations, the birth of formal banking and credit. To solve the merchant's dilemma, networks developed instruments like the saftoja, a letter of credit. Here is how it worked. The Baghdad merchant would take his silver to a trusted banker or sarraf in the city's market. He would deposit the full amount and receive in return a carefully written, coded letter. This document was lightweight, easy to hide, and worthless to anyone but the intended recipient. The merchant would then send this letter via a fast courier to Cordoba. His agent there would present it to the banker's correspondent in the city, who, after verifying the complex codes and signatures, would hand over the equivalent value in golden dinars or whatever local currency was needed. The actual silver never moved. It stayed in Baghdad, serving as the backing for this paper promise. Economic historians point to this as a watershed moment. By separating value from its physical medium, these systems drastically reduced the risk of robbery. More importantly, they unlocked capital. A merchant could now engage in multiple, large-scale ventures simultaneously, using credit to fund a new purchase in one city while his profits were still traveling from another. This financial fluidity made the entire trade network faster, larger, and more resilient. The genius of the system rested entirely on human networks. It was operated by far-flung merchant diasporas whose bonds of kinship, religion, and shared commercial law created a web of enforceable trust. The Jewish Radhanite merchants, for instance, maintained a network stretching from France to China in the early medieval period, using family ties and shared legal traditions to honor one another's letters. Later, the Muslim Karimi merchants dominated the Indian Ocean and Red Sea trade with a similar consortium. Their records, found in places like the Cairo Geniza, a storeroom of medieval Jewish documents, reveal centuries of detailed contracts, letters, and account books. These are not dry ledgers but vibrant conversations filled with personal news, disputes, and instructions, proving that finance was deeply human. This evolved into systems like hawala, which means transfer or trust. In hawala, no formal letter might even change hands. A merchant in India wishing to send funds home to Yemen would give the money to a local hawaladar. The hawaladar would use a secret code, often just a word or number, sent via message to his counterpart in Yemen. The recipient in Yemen, upon uttering that code, could collect the funds from the second hawaladar. The two brokers would later settle the debt between themselves through future trades or a periodic balancing of accounts. The entire multi-thousand-mile transaction was completed on a handshake and a reputation. So we must ask, what is the true foundation of an economy? Is value stored in the metal of a coin, or in the invisible web of promises between people who may never meet? The desert trade answered clearly. It was the trust that mattered. This sophisticated financial web did not exist for its own sake, however. It was the circulatory system for a body of trade where the goods themselves carried meanings far deeper than their market price. The scent of sanctity had a very specific geography. In the hushed inner sanctum of a temple in Jerusalem, or beside a funeral pyre in imperial Rome, the air did not simply smell of smoke. It carried the unmistakable, resinous sweetness of frankincense, a perfume that had begun its life as sap weeping from a scraggly tree in the remote mountains of southern Arabia. This was not a local herb. Every grain of that sacred incense had crossed 1,000 miles of the world's most hostile desert, its journey a testament to one of history's most powerful economic forces, the trade in faith itself. Classical writers were obsessed with its cost. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder grumbled in his writings that the empire was being drained of its wealth, with caravans bringing back these aromatics at an exorbitant price that made them worth more than their weight in silver. Why such value? Because frankincense and its companion, myrrh, were not mere luxuries. They were essential. In ancient Egypt, they were crucial for temple rituals and the intricate process of honoring the departed. In Jewish tradition, frankincense was a key component of the sacred incense burned in the temple. For Greeks and Romans, these resins purified spaces for worship, honored the gods, and masked the scent of loss during funeral rites, a practice believed to ease the soul's passage. This created an insatiable demand, a spiritual need that money had to fill. To meet it, a dedicated highway emerged, the legendary Incense route. It began in the Dhofar region of modern Oman, where the rare Boswellia trees were carefully tapped. The hardened resin tears were gathered and loaded onto camels for a months-long trek north. The route snaked up the western edge of the Arabian Peninsula, a narrow corridor of marginally safer travel between the desert's dead heart and the Red Sea. Control of this corridor meant unimaginable wealth, and no one mastered it better than the Nabateans. As we've seen, their rose-red capital of Petra was strategically placed to command this flow. Every caravan heading to Mediterranean ports like Gaza had to pass through their domain, paying heavy taxes for water, protection, and passage. The Nabateans grew so powerful from this sacred toll that they became the gatekeepers of the god's own perfume. Perhaps the most famous symbolic journey of all time captures this essence. The biblical magi, the wise men from the east, are said to have brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Scholars note these were not random presents. They were the ultimate diplomatic offering, representing the pinnacle of the luxury trade, with frankincense for divinity and myrrh for mortality. Their journey, whether historical or allegorical, maps perfectly onto the established incense routes, showing how the paths of commerce and pilgrimage were one and the same. So we must reflect, how does a spiritual desire reshape the physical world? It can carve entire kingdoms out of rock and send treasure across continents, all to fulfill a need that exists not in the body but in the human spirit. And on those same dusty trails, moving in the opposite direction to the incense, came travelers seeking not profit but profound connection. The scholar's ink was black, but the ideas on the page were a mosaic of colors from across the known world. In a quiet scriptorium within 9th century Baghdad's House of Wisdom, a man bent over a fragile parchment. The text was in Greek, a treatise on the motions of the stars by Ptolemy, and it had reached his desk only after a perilous desert journey from a Byzantine monastery. The same caravan guards who protected bales of pepper and cinnamon had, perhaps unknowingly, shielded this cargo of celestial knowledge. This scene was repeated countless times. The desert trade routes, arteries for commerce, became the indispensable nervous system for the movement of the human mind. Pilgrims, scholars, and their sacred or scientific texts hitched rides on the commercial infrastructure, transforming these paths into highways of intellect and faith. Historians of science emphasize a crucial point. The transmission of foundational knowledge from east to west was not an abstract process. It was a physical one, reliant on the stamina of camels and the safety of caravanserais. The mathematical concept of zero, along with the decimal numeral system we use today, traveled from India into the Islamic world and later to Europe along these trails. Chinese advances in medicine, alchemy, and papermaking moved westward by the same means. This was a grand, centuries-long conversation, and the desert was the quiet corridor through which it was conducted. Major religious pilgrimages were perhaps the most profound expression of this mobility. The Muslim Hajj to Mecca, a duty for believers, was a logistical marvel that mirrored the great commercial caravans. Thousands of pilgrims from as far as Spain and Central Asia would gather in major cities, joining merchant trains for protection, following established watering holes, and relying on the network of way stations. Their journey was one of spirit, but its mechanics were pure desert trade. Similarly, Buddhist monks from China undertook epic journeys to India, the homeland of their faith, to obtain original scriptures. The most famous of these, the monk Xuanzang in the 7th century, traveled for 16 years across the Taklamakan Desert and over the Hindu Kush Mountains, returning with hundreds of sacred texts. His travelogue, filled with observations about the kingdoms and cultures he passed, became a priceless geographical and historical record, a byproduct of a spiritual quest made possible by the existing Silk Road. The wealth generated by trade didn't just move knowledge, it built permanent homes for it. In cities like Timbuktu, the profits from the salt and gold exchange funded the construction of great madrasas and libraries. The University of Timbuktu centered on mosques like Sankor, attracted scholars from across Africa and the Middle East, creating a vibrant center for the study of law, astronomy, and medicine. Its thousands of surviving manuscripts, written in Arabic and local languages, are a direct testament to how commercial surplus was converted into intellectual capital. So how does the movement of knowledge differ from the movement of silk or gold? A bolt of silk is depleted when used, a coin is spent, but an idea, once translated and shared, multiplies. It does not deplete the source, it enriches both the giver and the receiver. This non-rivalrous quality made knowledge the most transformative cargo of all. And when these streams of thought and belief converged at crossroads, they didn't just coexist, they blended, giving rise to entirely new forms of beauty that we can still touch today. The brush revealed a curve of pale ceramic, its surface painted with a deep, luminous blue. In a Central Asian dig site, an archaeologist holds a physical fragment of conversation, a Chinese-style bowl adorned with Persian cobalt floral patterns. This is not a mistake or an accident. It is a deliberate fusion, an object born from the collision of worlds along the desert trade routes. While chronicles record kings and battles, the true story of cultural exchange is often told in the silent language of artifacts, in the clay, thread, and glass that reveal how people borrowed, adapted, and created something entirely new. Art historians study these objects as dialogues. A technique perfected in one region would travel with artisans or through detailed descriptions carried by merchants. The secret of Chinese porcelain, that hard, translucent, ringing ceramic, was a closely guarded state secret for centuries. Yet its aesthetic ideal, the desire for that pure, white body, influenced potters from Persia to Italy, who spent generations trying to replicate it with their own local clays and glazes, creating new ceramic families like Iznik-ware in Turkey or Delftware in Europe. The influence flowed in all directions. Persian carpet weavers incorporated Chinese cloud and dragon motifs into their intricate floral designs, creating a hybrid visual language that became prestigious across continents. Hellenistic artistic styles, carried east by Alexander's legacy, reappeared centuries later in the Buddhist art of Gandhara, where statues of the Buddha were carved with the serene faces and draped robes of Greek gods. These were not random copies, they were conscious adaptations for new audiences and new meanings. Often, these hybrid styles were created specifically for the export market, showing an ancient grasp of global consumer taste. Workshops in Egypt produced intricate glassware that mimicked Roman designs for sale up the Nile. In China, during the Tang dynasty, potters crafted figurines of Central Asian camel drivers and dancers, catering to a domestic fascination with the exotic West. The physical evidence is scattered across the globe. Sasanian silver plates from Persia have been found in Chinese tombs of the nobility. Shards of Roman glassware turn up in royal burials in Korea. Fragments of printed cotton from India, bearing patterns of elephants and deities, have been unearthed at Red Sea ports in Egypt. Each piece is a frozen moment of connection. One of the most profound technological transfers is embodied in Samarkand paper. After Chinese papermakers were captured following a battle in Central Asia in the 8th century, they began production in Samarkand, combining their knowledge with local resources like linen and hemp. The resulting paper was stronger and more versatile than parchment, and it quickly spread throughout the Islamic world, fueling an explosion of scholarship, administration, and literature. This was not just a product being traded, it was an entire industry being transplanted and adapted. So look at the objects that surround you today, the clothes from one continent, the device assembled in another, the design influenced by a third. What story of our own global blend will they tell an archaeologist 1,000 years from now? These material threads wove a resilient tapestry, but that tapestry was always vulnerable to being torn by forces far greater than any desert storm. The deep blue of the Indian Ocean was a sight no desert caravan master had ever seen. In 1498, a Portuguese fleet led by Vasco da Gama completed the unthinkable, sailing from Europe around Africa's southern tip and directly into the spice ports of India. This was not just a new route, it was a death sentence written in saltwater for a 1,000-year-old world. The balance of power, meticulously maintained across continents by Camel and Caravanserai, began to tilt on its axis. A merchant in Cairo or Aleppo might have felt the change first, not as a dramatic collapse but as a slow, chilling silence. The great caravans from the east arrived less frequently, their loads lighter, their stories speaking of cheaper goods now arriving by ship. Historians describe this as a classic case of technological and geographic disruption, where a new, more efficient network renders an older one obsolete. The sea offered staggering advantages. A single large ship could carry the cargo of 1,000 camels, with lower risk of banditry and no need to pay tolls at every desert oasis and mountain pass. The cost of pepper and silk in European markets plummeted, but the wealth now bypassed the ancient inland cities entirely, flowing instead to coastal Lisbon, Antwerp, and later Amsterdam. We can almost hear the lament of a Silk Road merchant, passed down in chronicles, something like, "The sea has stolen our purpose. The gold no longer stops here. Our gates are open, but the world walks around them." This maritime revolution was the final blow to a system already under immense strain from other forces. For a brief, shining moment in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire created what historians call the Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace. By uniting the vast steppes and deserts of Asia under one authority, they suppressed local banditry and standardized trade laws from the Pacific to the Black Sea. For a few generations, it was said a maiden carrying a sack of gold could travel the length of the Silk Road unharmed. This safety sparked a final golden age of overland exchange, with figures like Marco Polo traversing the continent. But the Mongol Empire fragmented, and its successor khanates often warred with one another, reintroducing instability and risk just as the sea routes were emerging. Further west, another empire rose that would inadvertently accelerate the shift. The Ottoman Empire, after conquering Constantinople in 1453, controlled the critical land bridges between Asia and Europe. By taxing overland trade heavily, they gave European kingdoms a powerful economic motive to seek a way around them, directly funding the voyages of exploration. Alongside these political earthquakes, the environment itself shifted. Paleoclimatologists studying ancient lake beds and tree rings note periods of prolonged drought, a gradual drying that made certain desert passages even more lethal and water sources more scarce, adding a final, natural pressure on the viability of some routes. The fate of the great caravan cities reflects this complex decline. Petra, the rose-red capital of the Nabateans, had already faded into a ghost town centuries earlier, its lifeblood of incense trade diverted by shifting Roman policies and new sea lanes in the Red Sea. Its magnificent facades were left to the wind and the local Bedouin, forgotten by the wider world until a Swiss explorer rediscovered them in 1812. Other cities displayed a remarkable resilience, adapting rather than vanishing. Aleppo, in modern Syria, saw its overland caravan trade diminish, but it evolved into a major regional manufacturing and agricultural center, its famous souks adapting to new, more localized networks. The story is not one of a single, catastrophic end, but of a slow transformation. After the 15th century, the Silk Road as a primary artery for transcontinental bulk trade was essentially over. Yet local and regional trade along its segments never ceased. Carpets, tea, and horses continued to move along ancient tracks, just not on the world-shaking scale of before. This forces us to ask a profound question about the infrastructure that connects our world. What makes a trade route or any network truly obsolete? It is not when it disappears from the map, but when it ceases to be the most efficient vessel for the most valuable currents of its age. The desert routes were defeated by a combination of cheaper alternatives, political barriers, and environmental stress. Their purpose was outsourced to the oceans, yet as the last camel trains grew smaller and the caravanserais fell silent, something crucial remained. The knowledge of those paths, the memory of those connections, did not vanish. It simply retreated into the sand, waiting for a new kind of traveler to arrive, one armed not with goods for trade, but with questions about the past. The silence of the desert had kept its secret for centuries. In August 1812, a man who called himself Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah stood at the entrance to a narrow, winding canyon in southern Jordan. He was, in fact, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer traveling in disguise as a Muslim pilgrim. Following a local guide's hint about a lost city, he entered the cool, shadowy gorge known as the Sick. After walking for nearly a mile between towering cliffs, the passage suddenly opened. Before him, glowing in the afternoon sun, was a monumental facade carved directly into the rose-red rock, a sight no European had documented for over 600 years. He had found Petra, the fabled capital of the Nabateans, a city the desert had swallowed and then, reluctantly, gave back. This moment of rediscovery was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a new era. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw a wave of explorers, often funded by European empires or geographical societies, venture into the deserts of Asia and Africa with a new goal, not to trade but to map, document, and extract. They were driven by a potent mix of scientific curiosity, imperial ambition, and a romanticized vision of the Orient as a land of mystery and buried treasure. Their travelogues, filled with tales of hardship and discovery, captivated the public and framed these ancient routes as exotic, forgotten worlds. Historians of archaeology note that this period, for all its problematic context, marked the birth of systematic study of these trade networks. Figures like the Hungarian-British explorer Aurel Stein traversed the Taklamakan Desert, meticulously mapping the ruins of Silk Road outposts. The Swedish geographer Sven Hedin braved the deserts of Central Asia, filling in blank spaces on European maps. Gertrude Bell, the British writer and administrator, traveled extensively through the Middle East, her photographs and diaries documenting ancient caravan cities like Palmyra long before modern conflict. Their methods, by today's standards, were often invasive. Stein's most famous act was removing thousands of ancient manuscripts, paintings, and textiles from the library cave at Dunhuang in China in 1907. This sealed chamber, hidden for nearly a millennium, contained a priceless cross-section of Silk Road life, from Buddhist sutras to commercial contracts and personal letters. While this preserved the materials from local neglect, it also dispersed a nation's heritage across foreign museums, a practice modern scholars grapple with as both preservation and looting. Similar chance discoveries happened elsewhere. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found in caves near Qumran in the 1940s, were preserved by the same dry desert climate that protected Silk Road documents, their location situated along ancient trade and pilgrimage routes. In southern Africa, the investigation of the magnificent stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe, beginning in the late 19th century, revealed it as a major hub of a vast inland trade network for gold and ivory, challenging colonial narratives that denied sophisticated African civilizations. The romance of the lost city proved a powerful motivator. For generations, scholars and adventurers searched for Yubar, a legendary trading center in the Arabian desert mentioned in the Quran and Bedouin tales as a city punished for its arrogance and swallowed by the sands. In the 1980s and 90s, a team using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and clues from ancient texts like Ptolemy's geography believed they had found its location in Oman. The site, now called Shisar, revealed evidence of frankincense trade and a catastrophic collapse into a sinkhole, showing how modern technology could finally pin down places that had lived only in myth. This entire era forces us to ask a difficult question. How are the stories we tell about the past shaped by who is doing the discovering and what they are looking for? The 19th century explorers saw ancient glory and ripe opportunity through a colonial lens. Today, the romantic rediscovery has given way to a more collaborative, scientific, and urgent examination. Archaeologists now work with local communities, using tools like satellite analysis and drone mapping to study these routes without disturbing them, driven by a new imperative, not to claim treasure, but to understand a system whose legacy is vanishing beneath modern pressures. From a satellite's cold eye, the Arabian desert reveals a palimpsest of human ambition. Etched across the golden sands are the faint, meandering scars of ancient camel tracks, and overlaid upon them, ruler straight lines of modern highways and the thin, purposeful threads of pipelines. They do not erase the old paths, they trace them, a ghostly alignment across centuries. This is not a coincidence. It is proof that the fundamental logic of desert trade never vanished. It simply upgraded its vehicles. The ancient imperative, find the most efficient, secure corridor across impossible terrain, still dictates where we lay our most vital modern infrastructure. Geographers and logistics planners call this path dependency. Once a route proves itself, minimizing natural hazards and maximizing access to scarce resources like water, it becomes etched into the landscape's memory. The wisdom of 1,000 caravan masters, earned through trial and fatal error, identified these optimal geographical arteries. Today, we pour asphalt and lay steel along those same proven corridors because the desert's rules of survival have not changed. Consider the monumental trans-Saharan highway. This ambitious, partially complete network aims to link North Africa with the nations south of the Sahara. Its proposed path is not a new idea on a blank map. It follows the historic axes of the salt and gold caravans, connecting ancient hubs like Timbuktu and Gao to coastal ports, because those locations were chosen for the same reasons millennia ago: access to water and convergence of trails. On a far grander scale, look east to China's Belt and Road Initiative, often called the New Silk Road. Its overland economic belts deliberately retrace the ancient desert and mountain passages of Central Asia. New rail lines and highways now cross the Taklamakan Desert, not far from the ruined Oasis cities that once served camel caravans. The goal is identical: to move goods and influence across a continent, but the scale and speed are now measured in container trains and geopolitics instead of camel trains and local kings. Even the flow of information follows these ancient rules. Vast bundles of fiber optic cables carrying the world's digital lifeblood are often routed through desert regions. The reasons are strikingly familiar: security and directness. Deserts offer fewer obstacles for trenching cables, and away from dense urban areas, reduced risk of accidental damage. The route from Asia to Europe through Egypt's desert, paralleling the old Incense route, is a major data corridor today. We have simply traded scrolls and rumors for terabits and terabits of data. The modern Oasis city is a direct descendant of this legacy. Places like Dubai or Las Vegas did not emerge from agricultural plenty. They are deliberate creations, hubs in new networks of global finance, tourism, and entertainment. They offer the modern equivalents of water, security, and market access, skyscrapers and luxury resorts rising from the sand just as Petra's temples once did, sustained by wealth flowing in from elsewhere. Look at the Qatar-Oman Highway project, a direct link being carved through the empty Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. Its purpose is pure connection, to bypass geopolitical complexities and create a faster, more secure land route between two nations, mirroring the old tribal treaties for safe passage. So we must ask, are we really doing anything new? The commodities have transformed from silk and salt to hydrocarbons and data packets, but the essential transaction remains the same, moving what is valued from where it is abundant to where it is desired, across a landscape that resists the very act of passage. Understanding these ancient systems is therefore not just an academic exercise. It offers a crucial lesson for our shared, interconnected future, that the most resilient networks are often those built upon the deep, hard-won knowledge of the land itself. This legacy, however, is not frozen in asphalt or fiber. It lives on in the cultural memory of the people whose ancestors walked the sands, and in a growing global movement to preserve not just the artifacts, but the very spirit of those ancient journeys. That ancient qanat, delivering water for centuries, now often runs dry beside a modern pumping station. The contrast is stark, a lesson in time scales written in the sand. Where traditional systems measured use in generations, modern extraction often thinks in quarterly reports, depleting fossil aquifers that took millennia to form. This is not just a historical curiosity, it is a pressing question for our own era. What can the slow, deliberate wisdom of the desert trader teach our fast, interconnected world about surviving on a planet with finite resources? Environmental historians point to systems like the qanat as masterclasses in sustainable engineering. They worked with the landscape, not against it, using gravity instead of pumps and protecting water from evaporation by keeping it underground until the moment of use. Their maintenance was a communal responsibility, a shared understanding that the survival of all depended on the care of this one fragile system. This reflects a core principle we are relearning today: adaptive resource management. It means observing limits, planning for replenishment cycles, and designing systems that are inherently conservative rather than extractive. The resilience of these ancient networks offers a blueprint built from necessity. They thrived not through brute force, but through intelligent design principles we would call robust today. The first was redundancy. A savvy caravan master never relied on a single oasis or mountain pass. He knew multiple alternative routes, so if one was blocked by conflict, drought, or bandits, the entire enterprise could pivot and continue. Our modern global supply chains, for all their complexity, often lack this simple redundancy, creating fragile single points of failure. The second principle was flexibility. Schedules were not fixed by a calendar but were adaptive, changing based on seasonal wind patterns, the availability of pasture for camels, and political conditions at distant way stations. This built-in flexibility allowed the system to absorb shocks without breaking. The third, and perhaps most vital, was the deep integration of local knowledge. Survival depended on the guide who could read the dunes and taste the wind, the oasis dweller who knew the exact capacity of the spring. This was not data in a cloud, it was wisdom in the community, continuously updated and immediately applicable. We can see the application of these ancient lessons in contemporary challenges. Consider drought response. Researchers studying how caravans managed scarce water find strategies of meticulous rationing, shared responsibility for the resource, and advanced knowledge of hidden reserves. These are precisely the community-based approaches now being revived in arid regions facing climate change, moving beyond crisis response to building long-term cultural resilience. In supply chain security, logistics experts are now designing what they call multimodal and multi-path networks, consciously building in the redundancy and optionality that the Silk Road possessed organically. And for engineers designing habitats for resource-scarce regions or even future space colonies, the closed-loop systems of an oasis, where waste is minimized and every output is an input for another process, provide a powerful model of sustainable life support. So we must pause and reflect. What can our high-tech, just-in-time global economy, so efficient yet so brittle, learn from these slow, deliberate, and resilient systems? The wisdom of the desert suggests that true security lies not in maximum speed and minimal cost, but in diversity of options, depth of knowledge, and respect for natural limits. This is not a call to abandon technology, but to layer it with ancient insight. The most encouraging sign is that this wisdom is not locked in the past. From farmers in Iran restoring ancient qanats to combat modern water scarcity, to urban planners looking at decentralized, walkable cities as a form of caravanserai for community connection, these principles are being actively revived and reimagined. They remind us that the solutions to our newest existential challenges may have been tested and proven in the oldest of laboratories under the relentless sun. The rhythm of the caravan is a beat that never truly faded. Today, that rhythm finds new life not in the transport of goods, but in the footsteps of travelers seeking connection. In the dunes of Uzbekistan, a guided camel trek follows a short segment of the ancient Silk Road, the swaying gait of the animals offering a physical echo of the journey that once moved continents. Far to the west, in Mali, the festival Odesert once transformed the sands into a stage for music and gathering, a vibrant celebration of nomadic culture born from the same historical crossroads. These are not accidents of modern leisure. They are part of a deliberate global movement known as cultural heritage tourism, a powerful force aiming to revive the memory of these trade routes, celebrate their legacy, and channel economic life back into the regions they once enriched. It is the ancient journey repackaged for a world hungry for authentic experience. Cultural anthropologists who study this phenomenon see a complex dance. On one hand, tourism can provide vital funds for preserving crumbling caravanserais, funding local guides, and giving communities a tangible stake in their own history. On the other, there is a constant tension between respectful preservation and outright commercialization, between sharing a culture and staging a performance for an audience. The goal is a sustainable balance where the story fuels an economy that, in turn, protects the story itself. This revival takes many forms. At the highest level, UNESCO World Heritage designations protect entire cultural landscapes, like the Incense route cities in Israel's Negev Desert, granting them global recognition and conservation resources. Museums dedicated to the narrative, such as the Silk Road Museum in China or the Caravanserai Museum in Iran, curate the artifacts and context for a public that may never set foot on the sand. More active still are historical reenactment caravans, where enthusiasts retrace paths with period-accurate gear, and educational caravan of peace initiatives that use the ancient routes to promote modern cross-cultural dialogue. The challenges, however, are as real as the desert sun, ensuring that tourism revenue actually reaches local artisans, camel handlers, and historians, rather than leaking out to international chains, is a constant struggle. The influx of visitors to fragile archaeological sites, like the caves of Dunhuang or the ruins of Palmyra, requires meticulous management to prevent love from literally wearing away the past. This leads us to a reflective, perhaps unanswerable question. Can a comfortable, week-long camel trek with bottled water and a support vehicle ever truly connect us to the historical reality of a months-long struggle for survival? Or does it create a sanitized, romanticized version that obscures the true hardship and complexity of the original journey? Perhaps the value lies not in perfect replication, but in the spark of curiosity it ignites. The physical act of moving slowly across that landscape, of feeling its scale and silence, can plant a seed of understanding that no textbook ever could. It turns abstract history into a sensory, personal memory. This living engagement with the past, for all its modern compromises, keeps the story alive. And as we look to keep these stories alive, we are no longer limited to the surface of the sand. The next frontier in understanding these ancient networks lies not in following their paths, but in seeing straight through the earth that hides them. The archaeologist's new map is not drawn from dusty scrolls, but from the silent whispers of light reflected from space. In a lab, a researcher analyzes multispectral satellite imagery, where the Egyptian desert reveals a startling secret. Etched across the landscape are faint, perfectly straight lines, a geometric ghost stretching for miles, completely invisible from the ground. This is the trace of a Ptolemaic trade route, a 2,000-year-old highway for chariots and caravans, now only visible from orbit. This is the digital frontier of discovery, where cutting-edge technology is peeling back the desert's skin to show us the true, breathtaking scale of the ancient world's connections. We are no longer just finding lost cities, we are mapping the very arteries that connected them, revealing a global network far denser and more sophisticated than we ever dreamed. The revolution is powered by a suite of tools that act as time machines. LIDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to digitally strip away forest canopies or sand dunes, revealing the precise contours of ancient roads, irrigation canals, and settlements hidden below. Satellite photography, especially in infrared and other non-visible spectra, can detect subtle differences in soil moisture and vegetation health. These differences often outline the foundations of long-vanished buildings or the compacted earth of a trail trodden by countless feet. All this data is then fed into Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, powerful digital mapping software that allows researchers to layer these ancient features onto modern terrain, modeling how people moved and why they chose one path over another. Remote sensing specialists describe this as finally seeing the big picture of human movement across millennia. One researcher noted that before, we were studying individual sentences. Now we can read the entire chapter of how a landscape was used. The techniques are remarkably precise. Scientists can identify ancient footpaths through soil compaction signatures, where centuries of travel have subtly altered the Earth's density in a way that reflects specific wavelengths of light. They can locate lost caravanserais by recognizing the geometric ruin patterns of courtyards and walls from space. They can even model ancient climate conditions to understand why a route was viable in one century and abandoned in the next, correlating pollen data with shifting rainfall patterns to see the desert bloom and wither through time. This technological lens has led to stunning recent discoveries. Across the deserts of Arabia, Jordan, and Syria, satellite imagery has revealed vast, mysterious constructions known as desert kites. These are enormous stone walls, often in V shapes or complex funnels, stretching for hundreds of meters. For decades, their purpose was debated. Now, the aerial view confirms they are massive animal traps designed to channel gazelles or other herds into enclosures. Their sheer number and scale suggest organized, communal hunting on an industrial level, likely to supply meat, skins, and other products for trade caravans passing through these arid regions. It reveals a level of pre-planned resource management supporting the trade networks that we never fully appreciated. Another profound application is the mapping of the medieval trans-Saharan routes with unprecedented accuracy. By combining satellite data with historical accounts, researchers have been able to trace specific corridors across the emptiness, identifying sequences of way stations and confirming the locations of legendary but lost watering holes. Significant work on the Ustyurt Plateau, a vast desert straddling Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, has used these methods to chart the web of paths that connected the Caspian Sea with the Oasis cities of Central Asia, filling in a major blank spot on our map of the Silk Road's northern branches. So we must wonder what other vast networks lie hidden, waiting for the right wavelength of light, the right algorithm to reveal them. Could the sands of the Rub al-Khali conceal an even older Incense route? Might the go by hold the traces of migrations that predate Genghis Khan by thousands of years? This digital cartography is rewriting history in real time. Yet, as we map the past with this brilliant new clarity, a sobering irony emerges. The same global view that allows us to see these ancient patterns also shows us the modern threats closing in, the pressures that could erase this rediscovered heritage before we even finish understanding it. That crumbling mud brick watchtower, once a symbol of absolute security for passing caravans, now melts away under a sudden, violent downpour. This is not the slow work of centuries, but a new, accelerated decay. The very climate that preserved these sites in dry silence for millennia is shifting, and with it comes a wave of threats that endanger the physical memory of the desert trade routes. Heritage conservationists from organizations like UNESCO now speak of a race against time, particularly across the Sahara and the Middle East, where the legacy of these ancient networks faces a triple assault from environmental change, human greed, and modern conflict. The first threat operates with a terrifying, impersonal force. Rising global temperatures and altered weather patterns are destabilizing the delicate balance that kept ruins intact. Intense, unpredictable flash floods, like those now seen in arid regions, can wash away entire layers of an unexcavated settlement in a single season. The ancient mortar holding stone carvings together weakens under prolonged heat stress. In places like the Wadi Rum in Jordan, increased humidity and rare rainfall events are introducing salts into porous sandstone, which then crystallize and fracture the rock from within, erasing petroglyphs left by traders thousands of years ago. This is a slow-motion crisis, eroding context and evidence before archaeologists can even document it. Alongside this environmental pressure exists a more targeted human tragedy: the systematic looting of sites for the illegal antiquities market. Driven by poverty and the high prices paid for artifacts in distant capitals, illicit diggers descend on known archaeological zones with shovels and metal detectors. Their work is not careful excavation, it is demolition. They tunnel through walls, shatter pottery, and discard anything without immediate black market value, destroying the stratigraphic layers that tell the story of a site's chronology and daily life. A cuneiform tablet ripped from a library context loses its meaning. A statue removed from a temple loses its story. The financial incentive is powerful, creating a destructive economy that turns cultural heritage into clandestine commodities, severing objects from their history and their homeland. The third threat is the most visibly brutal: the damage inflicted by modern conflict and rapid development. Warfare brings both deliberate iconoclasm and collateral destruction. The world watched in horror as the ancient city of Palmyra in Syria, a glorious Silk Road metropolis, became a battlefield, while local archaeologists and citizens risked everything to hide and protect artifacts. Irreplaceable temples and towers were deliberately targeted and reduced to rubble. Beyond such intentional acts, the vibrations from heavy military vehicles, the establishment of camps on ancient tells, and the simple chaos of war erase fragile remains. Simultaneously, peaceful development poses its own challenges. New roads, farms, and urban expansion often proceed without thorough archaeological surveys, unknowingly paving over the very caravan tracks we are only now learning to see from space. Yet within these stories of loss, we also find profound tales of resilience and courage. During the conflict in Mali, when extremist groups occupied Timbuktu and threatened to destroy its centuries-old libraries, a secret operation unfolded. Librarians and ordinary citizens, at great personal risk, smuggled out over 300,000 precious manuscripts, texts on law, science, and poetry that charted the intellectual life of the desert trade, hiding them in basements and transporting them to safety. This heroic effort underscores a vital truth: the most effective protectors of heritage are often the local communities for whom it is a living identity, not a distant past. This presents us with an immensely difficult question. In a world facing immediate, overwhelming crises, from displacement to food insecurity, how do we justify the resources and attention needed to protect old stones and fragile manuscripts? The answer may lie in understanding what is truly at stake. We are not just saving objects, we are safeguarding a tangible record of human ingenuity and connection, a manual for resilience written across continents. When a desert caravanserai vanishes, we lose a chapter in the story of how diverse peoples cooperated, innovated, and thrived against impossible odds. Preserving this is not a distraction from modern problems, but a source of solutions, a reminder of our shared capacity to build bridges across the most formidable divides. The work is now an active, global endeavor, demanding international cooperation, innovative technology, and a deep respect for local guardianship. The desert sun beats down on a remote stretch of Jordanian landscape, but the quiet is broken by the careful scrape of trowels and the murmur of conversation in several languages. Here, a team of archaeologists from France, Japan, and Jordan works side by side with local Bedouin guides, whose families have known this terrain for generations. They are uncovering the stone foundations of a small Nabatean way station, a forgotten node in the vast Incense route network. The Bedouin guide points to a barely perceptible rise in the land, a clue invisible to the trained archaeologist's eye, but obvious to someone who reads the desert like a text. This scene is a microcosm of a new, collaborative era in understanding our shared past. It is no longer about a single explorer claiming a discovery, but about a global community of guardians working to preserve the fragile legacy of desert trade. This network spans institutions from Oxford to Beijing, universities, and non-governmental organizations dedicated to a common goal. Directors of massive digital projects like the Silk Road online database emphasize that their work is about democratizing knowledge. By making high-resolution scans of manuscripts, three-dimensional models of artifacts, and detailed site maps freely accessible online, they allow a student in Brazil and a historian in Uzbekistan to study the same object simultaneously, fostering a new kind of global scholarship. The philosophy is that preservation must be multifaceted. It involves the physical, like the painstaking stone-by-stone restoration of the stunning Shah-i-Zinda necropolis in Samarkand, where master craftsmen used traditional techniques to repair brilliant turquoise tilework. It involves the digital, creating immortal copies of texts that are crumbling in their libraries. And crucially, it involves the intangible, safeguarding the living knowledge of communities, from the craft of saddle making to the oral histories of navigation passed down through families. Key players in this effort are diverse. The International Council on Monuments and Sites, or ICOMOS, provides the scientific frameworks and international charters that guide conservation work worldwide. The Aga Khan Trust for Culture has been instrumental in revitalizing historic urban centers along the Silk Road, not just restoring buildings but improving livelihoods, understanding that a living community is the best guardian of its own heritage. National museums from Berlin to Delhi hold fragments of the story, and increasingly, their mission is to contextualize these objects within the grand narrative of exchange, rather than treating them as isolated treasures. This raises a reflective question for all of us. In our digital age, what is our role as global citizens in this story of preservation? It might be as simple as virtually exploring a museum's online collection, supporting responsible cultural tourism, or just sharing the fascinating story of these ancient connections. Every act of engaged curiosity adds a thread to the modern web keeping this history alive. And as these guardians piece together the physical evidence, they are also assembling the clues to one of the desert's most enduring and tantalizing puzzles, a mystery written not in stone, but in the collective memory of an entire continent. That legend of a golden caravan swallowed by the Taklamakan is more than a campfire story. It is a historical echo. For every bustling oasis city we have mapped, there exists a ghost, a whisper of a place or a journey that simply stopped, leaving behind a riddle written in sand and silence. These are the unsolved mysteries bequeathed to us by the desert trade routes, puzzles where history blurs into myth, and the landscape itself becomes a keeper of secrets. Historians sorting through ancient texts and fragmentary clues face a unique set of challenges. The desert is a master of both preservation and obliteration. It can freeze a moment in time, drying a scroll or a sandal for millennia, yet in the next storm it can erase a city's walls or fill in a vital pass, leaving no trace at all. Combine this with records that are often second-hand, exaggerated, or written by outsiders who never saw the places they described, and you have the perfect recipe for enduring enigmas. Consider the fabulously wealthy city of Aram of the Pillars, mentioned in the Quran. Described as a hub of towering architecture and immense pride, it was said to have been lost to the sands as a consequence of its arrogance. For centuries, scholars and adventurers have debated its reality. Was it a purely allegorical tale, or was there a historical counterpart, a major trading center that met a catastrophic end? Some researchers have pointed to the recent discovery of a site in Oman known as Ubar, identified through satellite imagery and linked to the frankincense trade, as a potential inspiration for the legend. Its collapse into a sinkhole provided a dramatic, plausible end that could have fueled stories for generations. Yet the definitive link to the mythical Aram remains just out of reach, a testament to how desert cataclysms can birth immortal legends. Then there are the disappearances of entire groups. The Greek historian Herodotus recounts the story of a Persian army of 50,000 men, sent by King Cambyses to attack the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis in the 6th century before the Common Era. According to the tale, this vast force marched into the western desert of Egypt and was never seen again. A sandstorm was blamed. For centuries, this was dismissed as a fable. Yet modern archaeological surveys in that brutal region have uncovered intriguing evidence, from fragments of weaponry to what appear to be well-like structures, suggesting a large, organized group did indeed perish there. The desert may have finally given up a fragment of the truth, but the full story of that vanished army remains one of antiquity's great cold cases. The mysteries are not confined to antiquity. We have gaps in our understanding of more recent networks. The magnificent Ming Dynasty treasure fleets of the 15th century, led by Admiral Zheng He, are famous for their naval voyages across the Indian Ocean. But their operations also required complex overland logistics and diplomacy. The precise routes and inland trading hubs they used to connect with Central Asian networks are poorly understood, their paper trails lost to time or political purges. Similarly, classical texts like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st-century Greek guide to Indian Ocean trade, name bustling ports and markets along the coasts of Africa and Arabia. Scholars can match some names to known ruins, but others remain stubbornly unidentified, their locations hidden beneath coastal dunes or modern cities, their wealth only a footnote in a sailor's log. Perhaps no mystery better encapsulates the romantic obsession of the 20th century than the search for Zerzura, the so-called oasis of the little birds. Mentioned in medieval Arabic texts, it was described as a white city in the desert, its gates carved with birds, full of treasure and guarded by sleeping giants. In the 1920s and 30s, the quest for Zerzura consumed a generation of European explorers and aviators, who swept over the vast Libyan desert in biplanes and Model T Fords, competing to find it. They found breathtaking landscapes and prehistoric rock art instead. Zerzura was never a single lost city, most scholars now agree. It was likely a collective memory of several fertile valleys in the Gilf Kebir Plateau, places that were green in a wetter climatic period and served as refuges, their locations forgotten as the desert reclaimed them. The search, though ultimately for a phantom, meticulously mapped one of the last blank spaces on Earth and showed how a poetic name could drive the exploration of an entire continent. So what is it that draws us, century after century, to these stories of lost caravans and vanished cities? It is more than greed for treasure. These mysteries represent the holes in our map of the human story. They are reminders of the scale of our forgetfulness and the power of the natural world to erase our grandest endeavors. Each empty space on the historical chart is an invitation, a question that whispers, what else have we missed? For every Petra rediscovered, there might be a dozen more way stations still buried, their stories waiting to tilt our understanding of how these global networks truly functioned. The desert has not given up all its secrets. It merely asks for patience, for the right technology or the right shift of the dunes to reveal the next chapter. The camel driver's hands at dawn told a story of sand, rope, and generations. Before empires rose or markets boomed, the desert trade was a human symphony conducted in calluses and whispered prayers. It was built not by faceless forces, but by the drover soothing a nervous animal, the guard scanning an empty horizon, the cook sharing a meager meal over a dung fire, and the merchant anxiously calculating margins in his head. These were the ordinary people whose lives, hopes, and fears were the true currency of the routes. We know of kings and caravans, but what of the individual who spent a lifetime walking between them? Rare fragments pull back the curtain. In the Cairo Geniza, a storeroom of medieval Jewish documents, a merchant's letter from the 11th century aches with a loneliness that transcends centuries. He writes to his business partner far away, pleading for news of his family and confessing his worry over a shipment of pepper delayed by bandits. His script is formal, but between the lines you can feel the weight of distance, the vulnerability of a man whose entire fortune and family's security are tied to the safe passage of a few camels across a hostile land. At a lonely caravanserai in Jordan's desert, scratched into a stone wall, is simpler graffiti, just a name and a date, a traveler's simple declaration, I was here. This was a way to assert one's existence in the void, a tiny anchor of identity in a landscape designed to erase it. Daily life on the trail was a study in endurance and social order. The caravan moved to the rhythm of the sun, rising before dawn to cover as much ground as possible in the cool hours. The hierarchy was strict, with the caravan master at the top, his authority absolute in matters of route and discipline. Guards maintained a wary perimeter, cooks prepared communal staples like dried dates, grain paste, and occasional meat, and the camel drivers, the true experts, were responsible for the health and pace of their precious charges. Camaraderie was essential for survival, forged in shared hardship, yet it existed alongside fierce competition. A merchant's status was measured by the size of his train and the quality of his goods, and negotiations at each oasis were a subtle battle of wits and reputation. For some, this life offered a narrow path to social mobility. A shrewd small-scale trader could, over years of successful journeys, build enough capital to join the ranks of the great merchant houses. A skilled guard or guide could earn a reputation that commanded higher pay and respect, but the perils were ever present, a constant shadow on the journey. Beyond the threat of bandits, there was the silent creep of illness in a place with no medicine, the career-ending snap of an ankle in a hidden crevice, or the ultimate fear, being left behind by the caravan if you could not keep pace. The desert showed no mercy to the weak. Now picture the most famous journey of all, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca. We hear of the king's staggering wealth, the tons of gold distributed along the way. But shift the lens. Imagine you are a salt trader from Timbuktu who has joined the royal retinue for safety. For you, this is the business opportunity of a lifetime. Your camels are loaded with salt slabs, and you walk amid a procession of 60,000 people. You marvel at the spectacle, but your mind is on practicalities, the condition of your animals, the bartering you'll do in Cairo's markets, the hope that this connection will secure your family's future for years. Your story is invisible in the chronicles of kings, but it is the bedrock upon which the king's legend was built. This human dimension is not locked in the past. Listen to the stories of a modern long-haul trucker crossing the American plains, spending weeks away from home, their cab their only sanctuary, their success measured in timely deliveries and careful fuel calculations. Or consider the migrant worker sending remittances back to their village, their journey also one of risk, loneliness, and profound hope. The technology has changed, but the essential human experience of crossing vast distances for security and opportunity remains a powerful thread. By remembering the calloused hands and hopeful hearts of those ancient travelers, we complete the circuit. We see that these routes were not just about the silk or the gold, but about the human need to reach, to connect, and to build a life across the intimidating spaces between here and there. The whispering sands of the Sahara and the stony silence of the go-by still hold the echo of countless footsteps. These deserts were not empty, they were a stage, and upon it, humanity performed one of its most astonishing acts, building arteries of commerce and culture across landscapes that seemed designed to forbid it. From the biological marvel of the camel to the digital maps drawn from orbit, we have traced a story of profound ingenuity. It is a narrative where empires rose on the taxes of salt and silk, where faiths and philosophies hitched rides with merchants, and where the slow fusion of art and ideas in caravanserais laid the groundwork for the world we know. This legacy is not locked away in museums. It lives in the invisible architecture of our modern lives. The trust-based letters of credit from Baghdad are the ancestors of our global financial networks. The adaptive, redundant paths of the Silk Road are mirrored in the design principles of our digital infrastructure and supply chains. The very highways and fiber optic cables that stitch our continents often follow the ghostly tracks of ancient caravans, proving that the logic of connection, once discovered, becomes eternal. So as you move through a day of instant messages and global shipments, pause for a moment. Reflect on the slow, arduous journeys that made all this possible. The greatest treasures carried across those impossible divides were never just silk or gold. They were the ideas that sparked revolutions, the beliefs that comforted nations, and the simple, enduring human relationships forged in the shared struggle against the void. If this exploration of how we triumphed over isolation has resonated with you, consider joining our ongoing caravan of discovery. Your subscription helps us continue to share these deep dives into the mysteries that shaped us. And we would love to hear your thoughts. Which desert empire or forgotten trade good captured your imagination the most? The conversation, like the journey, continues.